Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me. My name is Matt Nelson. I'm a fellow and apologist with the Word on Fire Institute, and I'm really excited to be a part of this conference. Let me start by saying thank you to Catholic Voices and Smart Catholics for extending the invitation to be a part of this. And I got to say, I just think that this theme is very important, this idea of sharing the church's story. And I hope that over the next few minutes, I'll be able to help you in your own lives share the church's story as evangelical Catholics. This idea of reaching the indifferent, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, is a really important issue. Now, most of you have probably encountered the indifferent in your own lives. People who don't take seriously the claims that we make as Christians, that don't take seriously perhaps the claims that any so-called organized religions make about what's true, good, and what is truly beautiful. Well, I'm hoping again today that by the end of this short talk that you'll have some tools in your tool belt that I've provided you with that you'll be able to take out into the workplace, into your home, wherever you find people who today are indifferent to Catholicism, indifferent perhaps just to religion in general, and be able to move them in intellect and in will to consider seriously what we claim Jesus Christ has done for the whole world. And so let me first start by saying that the topic is important because we all know people who are indifferent to the Christian faith. But we can also verify this by looking at many of the studies that have come out over the last 10 or so years from high-profile research organizations like the Pew Research Center, for example, which shows that in North America and in Europe, there's this growing denomination, so-called, of the unaffiliated, people who identify with no religion whatsoever. And so we see even in the scientific data that this is a real problem on all of the continents. And so this is a very relevant thing for all of us to be thinking about and to be considering as we think about how we as evangelists go out and share the good news, share the Christian gospel. This topic's important to me too because though I grew up in a good Catholic home, like so many today, when I went to university, I fell away from the faith and myself became indifferent to religion in general, and I guess you could say in a certain way, especially Catholicism. Well, eventually, obviously, I did come back to the faith and was moved out of that indifference. And so over the last few years, this has been something that I've thought a lot about, and I've written a lot about it, and I've had a chance both in more formal settings like this and many times in informal settings with my brothers and sisters in Christ, and in those who themselves are indifferent to the faith. I've had a chance to discuss with all these different people this issue, and I think I've got a few things I can offer you today that will help you in your duty to evangelize. So here's what I'm going to do. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to start by just saying a little bit more about our contemporary situation here as we face this problem of religious indifference in our culture. And then I'll end with a few practical tips that I can send you out with that I hope will assist you in your evangelical efforts. The first thing I want to do, though, is start with a passage of Scripture. And so this passage comes from the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verses 15 to 17. And you've probably heard this passage before. This is a warning that Christ is issuing through an angel to the city of Laodicea. And here's the warning. I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were either cold or hot. So, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing. You do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. So again, that's from the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verses 15 to 17. And there's this warning from our Lord to the city, Laodicea. Well, and it makes more sense too if we know a little bit about that city in that time. Now, obviously, this idea of lukewarmness, we've heard this before. That's a reference to the sort of spiritual complacency or indifference that we're talking about today, and this existed back then. Here's the thing about the city of Laodicea. It was a prosperous city, materially prosperous. At one point, it was rocked with a savage earthquake. They had to rebuild the city, and this is early in the first century. And when they rebuilt the city, it became very prosperous. They had banking institutions, they had a medical academy, they had goods that they exported out. Materially speaking, the people in Laodicea were doing very well. But, this is interesting, one thing they didn't have was cold or hot water. The neighboring cities had springs, either hot springs or springs of cold water. Laodicea did not have that natural resource. And so this warning, set in that cultural context, takes on a little more meaning once we know these little facts. Now, it's interesting because as we learn about this city that seems like it's got this sense of self-sufficiency because of the material prosperity. Remember the words in that passage, it says, "For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing. You do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked." They're deceived by themselves that they're okay, that they've got everything they need. And yet, what's really happening here is the material prosperity of those who live in Laodicea are in a way disguising their spiritual poverty. And so this is a warning, I think, that extends throughout the ages. And there's certainly an application here to our contemporary times. We know that we live in a time of material prosperity. And I think that's a good thing, but it has also predisposed us to this problem of indifference. Now, where does this religious indifference come from? Well, this kind of who cares attitude towards religion, I think often extends from a radicalized sense of self-sufficiency. Let's think about this for a second. We used to rely on people so much more than we did today. Think about if you wanted to learn something. Say there was some subject or topic you wanted to learn more about. Well, you essentially had to either seek out a book, you maybe had to go to a library, and maybe a bookstore if you're lucky enough to have one nearby, or you'd have to seek out an expert, a teacher. If you wanted to learn a language, for example, you'd have to find someone who knew that language who would be willing to teach it to you. But nowadays, all we need is Google or Wikipedia or an app to teach us the language that we desire to learn. It's all right there on our smart devices. This is a blessing, but we all know the sort of curse that it is simultaneously as well. We get caught then thinking that we have all this power ourselves, this power in our devices perhaps, this ability to do things ourselves. And as a result, this strong sense of self-sufficiency, and for sure, self-sufficiency can be a good thing. It can be a sort of virtue, as we are autonomous creatures that make decisions for ourselves and have to come to look at the facts surrounding whatever the sort of things are that are going on in our lives, whatever the decisions are that we need to make. We need to consider all the facts and make decisions and take accountability for ourselves. But this radicalized sense of self-sufficiency, I think, has caused in us, as a culture, this attitude towards God as an option, as something that maybe we once needed back in a time when we less were able to take care of things for ourselves, and God is sort of out there for us to, lay our, someone who we can put our head down on his shoulder when we need to, figuratively speaking, and reach out to. In times when maybe we knew less, say because of what science now has told us, maybe we feel like this is something that is from a bygone age that's no longer necessary. We come to see religion or God as a sort of device, kind of like what we hold in our hands, that's no longer useful. And so because we feel so self-sufficient, we set religion aside and we move forward trying to do it all ourselves. Well, I think this is a serious problem, and it's led to this widespread religious indifference that we've learned about. Robert Cardinal Sarah writes in his book, God or Nothing, that man no longer wishes to reflect on his relationship with God because he himself desires to become God. And that's exactly what I'm talking about here. we're too easily deceived to think that we don't need anything beyond ourselves. And in today's time, more than ever, this deception, I think, comes in strong upon us. And so we need to have the wisdom and pray for the wisdom ourselves as believers to not fall into that trap. But also, we need to continue to proclaim the gospel and proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ to remind people that, no, you do need God. In fact, that's what you're made for. And so how do we do that then? Well, I'm going to spend the last few minutes here telling you some practical ways that you can do that. I really like the method that the 17th century scientist, philosopher, theologian Blaise Pascal gives us. In his famous book, The Pensées, which are really a set of notes that were supposed to eventually become a book of Christian apologetics. In it, he provides some notes about how to approach religious indifferentism today. Now, in his time, this is written in the 17th century, it's amazing because he's writing for his time, and yet what he is suggesting 3 centuries ago is still just as applicable today, if not more. He was writing in the time of the Enlightenment. And so it was a different time in the culture, but we're still dealing with some of the negative fallout of the Enlightenment and the turn away from religion of his time. And so, as Dr. Peter Kraft has said, these pensées, which is French for thoughts, of Blaise Pascal are perhaps more relevant today than they were in the 17th century. So what does Pascal say we should do when we're dealing with the religiously indifferent? He says, first of all, we need to show that religion is reasonable. We need to show that religion, and he's speaking here especially of Christianity, is worthy of reverence and respect. And then step 2, he says, is make Christianity attractive. And then number 3, prove that it's true. I like how he especially distinguishes between the second step and the third step. So after he says, show that religion is reasonable, so that might involve showing the compatibility between faith and reason and explaining that just because you believe things by faith, it doesn't mean that you've turned your back on reason. It could mean, and this is more of what Pascal was thinking at the time, showing people that even though they think that they're self-sufficient in this radical way, that there's actually this sort of, as it sometimes said, God-shaped hole in their heart, that there's a desire for something that they never quite seem to be able to achieve in this life, and that there's an intuition that something is broken inside them, and that would be original sin in more theological terms. People don't necessarily use that language, but they know these deep truths about themselves and the human condition. And so by reframing religion, and especially Christianity, to people that we know, we come to show that religion is not something to take things away from them and remove things from their life, except for the things that aren't good for them. And Christianity can also be a positive thing, something that brings into their life the very things that they're looking for. So religion can be reasonable, both in ways that we might show that faith and reason are compatible, but also in the way that Christianity especially offers us what we're looking for. Next, Pascal says, and again, this is the distinction I like that he makes. He says, make Christianity attractive, make good men wish that it was true. So make them wish it was true, and then step 3, prove that it's true. And I think sometimes too often we jump into the proving that it's true, and we forget the psychological component of evangelization. We need, I think, to do things like tell the church's story to make Christianity attractive again. Tell the stories of the lives of the saints. Remember, Pope Benedict XVI said that the lives of the saints are the saints, he said, are the greatest arguments for the faith. There's so much there to be shared with the world. And unfortunately, too often, we've allowed people like the late Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins or these non-believers to tell what they think is the church's story, which is a distortion or a caricature. A lot of people don't know the stories about the best Christians who have ever lived, but because of the culture we live in, they've only heard the stories of perhaps some of the most sinful of Christians who have ever lived. So it's our duty then to make Christianity attractive again. And one way that we can do that is by telling the church's story. You know, this is what Bishop Barron did when he made the Catholicism series. And when that Catholicism series was released on public television, it reached countless numbers of people and resulted in many conversions and people looking seriously into Catholicism, if not coming to the fullness of the faith. And so there's just so much there to be gained by the church and really by the world if the story of the Christian faith, the story of the Catholic Church is told in the way that it ought to be. We can also make Christianity attractive by more practical strategies. When we're speaking to people and they're sharing with us what's deep on their hearts about their experience with the church, for example, or their reservations for taking organized religion seriously. They may have to pour out their heart for a long time before they're ready to really hear our responses or criticisms to the things that they've said. So we might find ourselves sitting across the table from these people, hearing them say things that are maybe misinterpretations or misunderstandings. We might not agree with the things that they're saying. We might even feel a slight offense at some of the things that they say. And our impulse is going to be to jump in on the conversation, maybe interrupt, or at least offer some kind of a rebuttal right away. But I think in our own lives, one of the ways that we can make Christianity attractive is to show that the power of God is alive in us too, even as evangelists. So much so that we can sit across from somebody and look at them in the eye as they're telling us the very reasons that they disagree with us and that they think that maybe they would even go so far as to say that we're delusional because of what we believe. But I'll tell you, when they see you non-reactive in a negative way, when they see you hold back from being confrontational and even suspend for the time giving your responses and maybe invite them to say more, that can go a long ways. And that's one small way that people can see that there is something to Christianity, because there's something to these Christians. They're different than other people because of the way they listen, the way they allow me to express my discontents with what they believe and what they hold to be the most important thing in their lives. Only then can we move into that third step, I think, appropriately, like Pascal says, which is to then prove that it's true. And I'll say one thing about that step, proving that it's true. And again, there's some interplay between these three steps, because sometimes in the way that we go about proving the faith to be true, that can be attractive as well. I like what St. Thomas Aquinas does, and this is a recommendation I want to give to you, the last one that I'll give you before I wrap up this talk. And that is, get to know well the objections to the faith. And when you're speaking to someone who doesn't believe what you believe, try to be so well prepared that you can phrase their objection even better than they can. That way, when you offer a response to their objection, they're more likely to listen to what you have to say and to be impacted by it. It's what St. Thomas Aquinas does in his Summa Theologiae, when he steel-mans, as it were, the objections to the very things that he's setting out to prove. And after he's described in the best way he can the position of those who disagree with him, then he moves on slowly, subtly, and somewhat technically. It's not an easy document to read, but he goes on then to carefully refute those steel-manned objections. And I think that's a very powerful and honest way for us to dialogue with those who disagree with us, to really take their position seriously too. Well, there's so much more that I could say about practical ways that we can go on to make Christianity attractive, and in an attractive way prove that it's true. Blaise Pascal has so much to teach us about how we can reach the indifferent, a problem that was something very serious that he faced in his time that apparently hasn't gone away and has perhaps intensified since the 17th century. So I would point you towards his Pensées and towards Peter Kreeft's commentary on his Pensées, which you'll be able to find online. And I think those are really great manuals for how to make Christianity attractive in the way Pascal meant. I'd also point you to Bishop Barron's Catholicism series as an example of how we can tell the church's story. And in our own small ways, we might be able to in some way emulate that style and do that in our own lives. So I'll leave you with a quote from the Second Vatican Council. This is from a document called Gaudium et Spes. And it gives us a glimmer of hope in these times when it seems like this religious indifference that we've all encountered seems to just be increasing all around us. Well, let this be a little bit of hope for you. Man is continually being aroused by the Spirit of God, and he will never be utterly indifferent to religion, a fact proved by the experiences of ages past and plentiful evidence at the present day. For man will ever be anxious to know, if only in a vague way, what is the meaning of his life, his activity, and his death. The most perfect answer to these questionings is to be found in God alone, who created man in his own image and redeemed him from sin. So God is always working on the hearts, the minds, the wills of everybody, no matter how indifferent they may seem. And let's put our hope in that even if we can't get the words quite right, or maybe despite our best efforts, we feel like we've failed to make Christianity an attractive option for people, that at the end of the day, regardless of our own efforts, God is always at work on even the most indifferent out there. So thank you for joining me, and enjoy the rest of the conference. God bless all of you.